Welcome to the podcast. If you'd like to listen to an ad-free version of this episode and all of our episodes, then search True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts and press subscribe. That's our premium channel where all of our ad-free and advanced episodes live, all in one place. True Crime Today Premium Plus. Search it on Apple Podcasts and press subscribe. Even try it for 3 days free.
You're about to take a deep dive into one of the biggest true crime cases in the universe. Or, at least, on our part of the planet. From the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today.
Okay, so today we're going deep into this really heavy case, the Stefan Sterns case. We've got this intense source, an interview with Stefan's parents, Deborah and Chris. And it's powerful stuff, really gives us a look into what a family goes through after something like this.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about the source is that we're hearing directly from the parents, you know? It's not just a summary of events. It's their raw emotion, trying to make sense of how the son they raised could be accused of these horrific things.
It's like we're right there with them, listening in as they try to process it all. And they start by describing young Stefan. He was energetic, laser-focused, loved animals. It almost sounds, well, idyllic, which makes the contrast with what comes later even more disturbing.
Right, and that's where this idea of trauma comes in. They talk about Stefan having this really bad accident when he was 7, a traumatic brain injury. Deborah and Chris seem to think that it really had a long-term impact on him.
Makes you wonder, could that be part of the explanation? Or are we just grasping at straws, trying to understand something that might not have a clear answer? I mean, as Stefan got older, Deborah talks about this change in him. Lying, maybe even stealing, playing on people's emotions. But then in the same breath, they say he was the one his friends went to for help, that he even thought about becoming a counselor. It's like, how do those two things even exist in the same person?
It's one of those things that makes psychology so fascinating and so difficult. You see this compartmentalization where people can hold these totally opposite sides of themselves. And it's not about excusing bad behavior, but trying to understand that sometimes the human mind is just incredibly complex. Someone can be capable of real empathy and still do really harmful things. It's like they're, I don't know, a mix of light and darkness all at the same time.
And it makes you question, like, how well can you ever really know someone?
Yeah.
You know? And it makes the parents' role in all this even more complicated. Because Deborah and Chris were very open about the fact that they didn't approve of a lot of Stefan's friends, especially Jennifer, Madeline's mother. Deborah even describes this chilling moment when she found out about the co-sleeping situation between Stefan and Madeline. Honestly, it's just unsettling.
Yeah, that's a tough one for any parent to hear. Co-sleeping, it's one of those things, a lot of different opinions on it, right? Cultural norms and all that. But in this context, given everything else, the age difference, the other warning signs Deborah and Chris were picking up on, it just feels really off.
Like that feeling when you know something's not right, but you can't quite figure out what it is. And what makes it even trickier is that Stefan had this pattern of lying, which made it almost impossible for them to know what was really going on. Deborah talks about trying to set boundaries, but it's like he was always pushing back, almost challenging them to stop him or something.
That raises such a tough question for parents, especially when you're dealing with a child who's been dishonest in the past. How do you balance that natural instinct to trust your kid with this awful feeling that something is terribly wrong?
And tragically, in this case, that's exactly what happened. On the day Madeline disappears, Chris gets these conflicting stories from Stefan. First, it's a flat tire, then it's silence. It's like textbook evasion, right? Trying to buy himself time, cover his tracks.
Exactly. Those inconsistencies, especially when someone's under that much pressure, huge red flag. The more far-fetched the excuses, the more suspicious it gets.
And then, this is where it gets really disturbing. Deborah and Chris are trying to help, and they stumble across this hard drive. Thousands of just awful images. They immediately hand it over to the police, but to be the ones to uncover that, I can't imagine the weight of that discovery.
It's like this whole other side of true crime that we don't always think about. You know, we get so caught up in the who and the why of the perpetrator, but there are all these other people hurting too, families left picking up the pieces.
And for Deborah and Chris, it's not just about the accusations against their son. It's the whole world knowing, judging. They're doxxed, threatened. Their lives are completely upended.
It really makes you think about that dark side of true crime, doesn't it? Where does that line between curiosity and almost like enjoying someone else's pain, where does that line even exist?
And yet, with all of that going on, Deborah says something that really got to me. She says, there were times you didn't even like him. I mean, that's real. That's honest.
It's like she's giving us a glimpse behind the curtain of this idea of unconditional love, you know? It's not always perfect. You can love someone with everything you have and still struggle with their choices, with the things they do.
And even more so when those choices lead to something as awful as this. But then they also say, as long as he's on this earth, our love is unconditional. How do you even wrap your head around that?
It speaks to how powerful that parent-child bond is, right? It's a love that doesn't make sense sometimes, a love that goes beyond logic, even when faced with something as terrible as this.
And it's not just about Stefan and what he may or may not have done. There are these lingering questions about Jennifer, Madeline's mother. Could she have done more to protect her daughter? Did she know what was going on?
Well, we can't ignore that Jennifer was given what's called derivative immunity for cooperating with the investigators. Basically, she can't be prosecuted for anything she might have admitted to while talking to them.
So they make a deal with her. Tell us what you know, and we'll protect you from legal consequences.
Right. It's a common legal tactic, but yeah, it definitely makes things ethically murky.
It does. And then there's this whole other layer that Deborah and Chris bring up. They seem convinced that there's more to the story, that this is just, I don't know, a small part of a much bigger picture. They mention financial stuff, Stefan having access to a lot of money, things that just don't add up for them.
It's like we're missing pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly. And it's almost like we're dealing with two different Stefans, right? On one hand, you have the son his parents describe, loving animals, being there for his friends, wanting to help people. And then there's this other side, this dark side, accused of these unspeakable acts. How do you even begin to reconcile those two extremes?
It's the question that hangs over this whole case. I mean, it reminds us that people are complicated, capable of both incredible kindness and just awful, awful things.
And sometimes those two sides exist within the same person. And that's maybe the most disturbing realization of all. We'll be right back to talk more about that, about those unanswered questions and what it all means for this case. We're back. In this case, I got to say, it's like the more we uncover, the more questions we have. We were talking about that bigger picture, the questions surrounding Jennifer, and the possibility that there's more to the story than meets the eye. It's tough to think about, but we have to look at every angle.
It's hard, right? We crave those clear-cut answers, especially in a case like this. But the truth is, sometimes the most important thing is being okay with not knowing everything. Sometimes you just don't get all the pieces.
It's a tough pill to swallow, especially for true crime fans like us. We want that resolution, you know. Bad guy caught, the puzzle solved. But real life, well, it's rarely that simple.
Right. It's messy. In this case, with all its twists and loose ends, I think it's a good reminder for all of us. We can't let our interest in true crime make us forget about the real people who are hurting, the real lives that have been shattered.
Absolutely. This whole deep dive, it's really driven that point home. It's not just about Stefan and the charges against him. It's about the impact on everyone around him, like Deborah and Chris, trying to make sense of this unimaginable situation, their love for their son pushed to the absolute limit.
And let's not forget Madeline. She's the real tragedy here. A young life cut short. We owe it to her to look at everything, even the parts that are hard to stomach. Like, what was Jennifer's role? Could she have done something, anything, to protect your daughter? Those questions need answers.
So many tough questions. You know, I keep thinking about something Debra said. There were times you didn't even like him. I mean, that just stayed with me. It shows that even in the middle of this horrible situation, their emotions are still complicated. Still real.
It makes their story that much more powerful, don't you think? They were so open, so honest, even about the hard parts, the doubts, the struggles of loving someone who could do something like this. There's a real lesson in that for all of us.
To remember that things aren't always black and white. Don't rush to judge, because the truth is usually messier, more complicated than we think.
And that's what makes this case, and others like it, so important to talk about. We have to be curious, yes, but we also have to be compassionate, curious enough to try to understand, and compassionate enough to remember that these are real people, real lives.
It's a heavy thing to carry with you, but it's a responsibility we can't shy away from. This deep dive, it's been tough, a real look into the darkest parts of human nature. But it's important, and I think ultimately it reminds us of the power of empathy, the need for understanding, and how strong the human spirit can be, even when faced with unimaginable tragedy.
In a world where the darkest secrets lie just beneath the surface.
They said it was an accident, but the evidence says otherwise.
Where hidden killers roam, unnoticed, in the shadows.
I think you would definitely be looking at a blend of toxic very bad narcissistic personality traits, and they will be vengeful and possibly resort to violence.
Join Tony Bruschi as he uncovers the truth behind the most chilling cases.
They said it was an accident, but the evidence clearly says otherwise.
Each episode, we dig deep into the minds of those who commit the unthinkable.
To your point on narcissism, he thinks in his own mind how witty he is.
Yeah.
But he lost that jury. I was done with him in 2 minutes.
From unsolved mysteries to infamous crimes.
Geez, you've just talked about how you've taught yourself how to do everything under the sun. I bet you did a YouTube video, how to best kill somebody with a knife.
Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi takes you where few dare to go.
How does someone with such a dark secret go unnoticed for so long?
With multiple new episodes every single day.
We're not just telling stories, we're seeking justice.
Listen now on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi.